James looked at his screen as Losovanaja Mjur stepped up to her small podium, climbing on top of it and standing high with two of her arms crossed, while the other two held onto the podium's sides to give her balance. The camera was focused closely on her lemur-like face, and the picture was steady, as she got ready to open another day of dealings within the Council of Primates.
Welcome, everyone, to the 6th official day of the meeting of the Council of Primates. I can see that we are all...
She paused for a moment and cleared her throat. She did that every day since the council had begun its meetings again after its week of break. She lowered her gaze a bit as she continued.
I see that we are all present and accounted for.
Without being asked to, the camera panned around for a moment, showing all of the representatives and their entourages lowering their gazes and closing their eyes for a minute, as the room fell perfectly silent, in a gesture of respect towards those who could no longer join them. James did the same. De mortuis nihil nis bene. No matter what his own feelings on the matter may have been, denying the dead his respect here would not only put him into a bad light in front of the entire galaxy, it also wouldn't make him feel better in any way. And so he, too, lowered his gaze and closed his eyes, while his lips remained sealed shut. After a minute of time, Losovanaja once again spoke up, causing the entire room to look up again.
Before we begin today's usual order of events, I was asked to say a few brief words about the Galactic election that was announced yesterday evening. I hope nobody has any objections to me taking up just a few minutes of your time to do just that, she announced, and glanced around for a bit. Obviously nobody was going to raise a stink about something that important being talked about in a setting like this one. After making sure of that for a moment, Losovanaja nodded, and her eyes and parts of her fur began to glow gently as she started to read off a prompt card she had brought with her. First of all, since many, if not most of us, have not seen a full-scale galaxy-wide election within our lifetimes, I would like to take a moment to reassure everyone who is watching about the process. Now that the election has officially begun, it will be split up into 2 phases. The first phase will officially begin 1 week after the election's official announcement, meaning 9 uniform days from now. The first phase will last exactly 1 uniform month, during which any aspiring candidate that is not yet known to the galaxy has the freedom to announce their candidacy officially, which will enter them into the Galactic Elections Online Database, or GEOD for short. An address to reach said database should appear on screen for our viewers right now, but it can also very easily be found online with a myriad of search terms, and a shortcut to it will also appear within every commonly used net browser once the first phase officially begins. Once a candidate has officially announced themselves and was entered into the GEOD, the people of the galaxy may cast a vote for them to become an officially recognised candidate in the running for the position of a council person. Every single citizen of the galactic community will have exactly 1 unique vote they may give for 1 unique candidate within the GEOD. Only those candidates who have at least 5 billion unique votes to their name will be officially in the running to become council person at the end of Phase 1. Any vote given to them after the 5 billionth will be automatically reimbursed and may be given to a different candidate instead. No vote is wasted.
James listened to the explanations quietly. Obviously, he and his associates had already spent the previous night by reading the declarations about the election up and down, and therefore he was already intimately familiar with the process that they will be going through in the near future. Thus, he was able to use this time during her explanations to truly let everything pass his mind once again. The system was incredibly weighted in favour of established powers, obviously. A normal person coming from nothing somehow earning the favour of 5 billion people within 1 uniform month was extremely unlikely, after all. Luckily, as someone who was already considered an official candidate as a carryover from the last election, he personally didn't have to worry about that all too much. Although, obviously, even in his current precarious situation, it was unlikely that not at least 5 billion people somewhere in the galaxy would still be on his side. Still, the people that would mostly be competing with him during the election, apart from members of the now defunct former Galactic Council, would most likely be established politicians hailing from other corners of the galaxy's affairs, celebrities, or possibly people like Quiz, who had started their own candidacy the moment that it had become clear that there would be an election, and thus already began making a name for themselves. Anyone else trying to join the race this late into the game would most likely need the support of someone more established than themselves. This too was of course an advantage that already established candidates had. Since they didn't have to worry about votes for themselves, they could freely endorse other candidates they wished to take part in the election along with them, without having to worry about it damaging their own chances. And the more people hailing from the same faction made it to the actual election, the bigger was the chance that a large number of people with the same ideas would make it onto the council in the end. Not exactly a very conducive system towards allowing new ideas to flourish, so James had been rather lucky to have gotten his foot in the door early. As an established power himself, he could use these hurdles they put into other people's ways to his advantage as well, and he was planning to do just that. But for now, his eyes remained focused on the screen in front of him, as he kept patiently listening, while Lossaranaja explained things to the galaxy that he already knew.
After the official candidates have been determined, the second phase of the election will begin. Once the candidates all know for sure that they are officially in the running, they will get to advertise themselves as potential council people some more. You all have seen election campaigns before, so I don't have to tell you how that part of the process will go. Therefore, I am going to jump straight to the end of Phase 2, which will be the final election, she explained, staring down at the prompt card in her hand yet again, to make sure she wasn't forgetting anything, or getting the numbers wrong. According to the current population size of the galactic community, it has been determined that the new Galactic Council is going to be filled with 137 council people. Unlike the election of the candidates within Phase 1, the vote of each galactic citizen will not be unique. Instead, every citizen may freely distribute votes of the same number as the final number of council people, so 137 total among all the eligible candidates, but only give one vote per candidate. Well, that's a bit confusingly worded, so I will summarize. You can give up to 137 candidates one vote each. You don't have to use every one of your votes, but are highly encouraged to do so during the election. The final election will be held on the 87th day of the 56th month of the current uniform year. That is the 7th day of the 8th week of the 56th month of the current year. Mark it in your calendars, people, although it will be hard to miss even if you don't. In the end, the 137 candidates with the most votes to their names will form the new Galactic Council.
Once again, James thought about that. Things were weighted against newcomers here as well. After all of those who already had their eligibility confirmed didn't need to wait until Phase 1 was over to go all out with their campaign for election. But apart from that, other than resources and things like that always played a role in big events like this one, the second phase seemed overall less stacked against them, all things considered.
Now that we have established that,
Lossaranaja said, and visibly perked up a bit more as she spoke, causing everyone to pay closer attention to her than before, while her luminescence increased a bit in intensity.
I would also like to take a moment to personally congratulate those among us who have already cleared the hurdle to become officially recognized candidates to the position of a council person.
Her gaze first shifted to someone in the room with her, and the camera giving James his remote view needed to shift to follow her gaze, as it zoomed in onto a familiar face.
First, Commander HFY, officially endorsed by the former councilman Halaforta, who officially stepped back from the election after the previous council was disbanded, she said, while the Grassagap on screen now stood up respectfully, and briefly bowed to both sides of the room.
As always, it will be my honor to serve,
the commander said with a serious expression. There was a moment of applause that James joined in with out of politeness alone. Lossaranaja clapped for a few seconds longer than everyone else, as she brought her gaze around a bit, along with a gesturing arm. The camera's point of view constantly followed her gestures as she announced,
Next, the Honourable Farthak Ruktosma, endorsed by the former councilwoman Nikki Maji. He was one of the people in the talking to fill Councilman Rujigio's, may he rest in peace, empty seat.
Much like the other ape, Ruktosma stood up and used 2 of his forearms to wave to the cameras and the people around him. Unlike the commander, he wasn't the main representative of his people, but merely one of the people brought as an entourage. Still, the applause for him was not lesser than that for the commander had been. As he distractedly clapped along, James couldn't help but feel like he had heard that name before. Somewhere. Although he couldn't put his finger on it right now. And since his own entourage was busy with way more important things than sitting next to him right now, there was also no one he could poke for a reminder really quick. He would simply have to keep it in mind for later. Stopping her applause, Losavanaja then moved her attention down to her own podium, seemingly making a few quick inputs into a personal assistant that was laid flatly on top of the wooden structure.
And finally,
she mumbled into her microphone, while finalizing her commands to the machine, which caused the feed of James's own transmission to the room, where the meeting took place, to be projected onto a larger monitor, which he could see in the background on his own screen.
Ambassador and First Lieutenant James Orwin, who was once endorsed by a whopping 3 current and acting council people, as well as the Leader Supreme of the GCS herself. Although most of them has since withdrawn their support, he not only remains the endorsed candidate of former acting councilwoman Laura Porthia, he has also had the support of almost half the galaxy on his side during the last election. Additionally, his current candidacy has been ratified by the previous Galactic Council, led by Councilman Afuna.
The stacking of his credentials made James swallow slightly, as the way that the Pixamaria phrased it truly made it seem like he had way more galaxy-wide support than he actually did. He wasn't sure why Laura Porthia still endorsed him, but since she was not an elected council person, he doubted that it mattered much. And Afuna only supported his candidacy in an effort to show that the galactic community did not actively prevent opposing voices from being heard. Additionally, the support of almost half the galaxy was something he had before a lot of more recent events had taken place, including, but not limited to, James declaring himself many people's enemy number 1 by publicly associating with and defending a realized AI. Overall, he doubted the actual support he got was anywhere near as impressive as Losavanaja made it sound. Still, he stood up in front of the camera to give a respectful bow to his fellow primates as his name was shouted out. After all, he couldn't just ruin his entire image by appearing petty now that the race had well and truly begun. He closed his eyes as he did so, not really feeling like looking at what he may have been shown on the screen as he did so. Hearing it would most likely already be enough. However, his eyes did quickly snap open again, and he swiftly looked up in surprise as he heard something he had not expected. Much like those that had been shouted out before him, he was getting applause, and it didn't sound like just a pittance given out of politeness and to save face alone. While it wasn't quite the same amount as the other primates had gotten, those who did clap their hands for James seemed to truly mean it, bringing their appendages together with great enthusiasm, even as some of their compatriots demonstratively crossed their arms, leaning back in their chairs to make entirely sure that everyone who watched got the message that they were not impressed. However, there didn't seem to be enough for one of them, as a small form stood up once again, after the applause had died down.
It's a disgrace that he is even allowed to stand with us today, much less the fact that someone like him can still even be in the conversation of being a councilman,
Commander Haljafir shouted, and the camera quickly panned towards him, showing off the tiny primate as his hands clenched into fists. The commander had a dark, resolute expression on his tiny face, as he stared up at James's projection with hate-filled eyes.
Barely a week ago, his people and their pet felines attacked this very station. Primate eaters, the bunch of them. They attacked poor citizens and murdered many of our own, and yet some of you still have the gall to stand there and applaud him? Shame on you!
His judging eyes wandered along the room, while his moss-green fur stood on end, getting quite mixed reactions out of the other people present. Some shrunk into themselves under his gaze, while others took to imposing posturing, as they built themselves up to face his accusing stare. James was honestly surprised that the man would go so openly on the offensive, after others had just shown their support for James. However, the man seemed to wear his heart on his sleeve a bit more than those people that James was used to. Maybe not quite politician material, much like James himself. Quietly, James requested to be granted the stage by Losaranaja, and it was quickly approved. The people who truly attacked the detention center and murdered Representative Glorabel will soon be brought to justice, he announced, staring at the screen in front of him. Only joining remotely sadly made it a bit harder to be physically imposing during his speeches, but he did his best to keep up a straight and confident posture. The UHSDF had nothing to do with the attack, and will do its best to clear up the true perpetrators. Of course, he should better not mention that they had a promising lead already. Commander Haljafier scoffed. Yes, don't think anyone has missed the forces your people have sent to the station, he said, with disdain in his voice. Here to destroy evidence, no doubt. James narrowed his eyes. Here to save what evidence hasn't been destroyed yet, he countered very directly, which seemed to irritate the commander to no end. However, before a battle of wits and words could break out between the two, Losaranaja overwrote the signal from both of their microphones and cleared her throat.
Gentlemen, save it for your campaigns, please, she admonished them, with intensely glowing eyes. We have our schedule to get back to now, so I would ask everyone to please leave anything pertaining to the Galactic election behind for the time being, while the Council of Primates returns to the topics at hand.
James wordlessly nodded and sat back down. Commander Haljafier hesitated a moment longer, but then finally also sank back into his seat, with what looked like an indignant huff, that was however inaudible, due to his microphone still not transmitting anything.
Well, that guy must be fun at parties.
James could hear a quiet voice mumble, and he chuckled a bit, knowing that only he could hear it, since he recognized the voice as Losarana's. The young Pixameria had very pointedly taken over the duty of playing James's cameraman, ever since he had to join these meetings remotely, and every now and then James caught the young man mumbling to himself in small comments on the proceedings, usually with at least slightly humorous results. But then, James sat up straighter in his seat, and began to prepare for his partaking in the upcoming day of the conference. Once it was over, everyone had said their goodbyes, and the feed to and from his remote location had been officially cut. James immediately jumped from his seat and hurried away. He really didn't have time for any dilly-dallying. That much was once again confirmed for him, as he hurried out of the secure room he had sat in, and immediately heard outraged voices, yelling not far away. The first thing he saw was the massive form of Morgoth. The enormous Ligomordular easily acted as a beacon that announced every interaction he was part of far and wide, even if he was not the main focus of it. Because in this case, he seemed to simply be backing up Viruk Skrata, the king of this local Rushgak hive. The large insectoid stood at the front of a moderately sized group, consisting of two of his own soldiers, as well as Levexar, and the already mentioned Morgoth. James needed to look a bit closer to see who the group was facing there, and also who was doing the yelling. However, as he did, his face immediately soured. Cora Hoffer and Firiane, Curie's parents, had taken an aggressive stance in front of the Deathworlders, either having forgotten or ignoring the fact that they could not physically impose by comparison at all. Both had their wings extended in a display to make themselves look larger, which fell completely flat in front of the giants they were dealing with.
I will not be denied my child, Cora Hoffer announced loudly. The court has made his choice. We are responsible for them, and we will make sure they get the help they need.
If you don't get out of our way right this instant, I promise it will mean serious trouble for you, Furian chimed in. Your Deathworld hive structures are already only tolerated with great reservations. Now imagine what would happen if it becomes known that you not only harbour criminals, but also make yourself guilty of withdrawal of those under protection as well.
Don't engage, James repeated, as a mantra in his mind, forcing his feet to keep walking while the confrontation went on. Let the experts handle it. You can only make things worse. Don't engage. Meanwhile, Virux Scrata once again proved that he would be much more deserving of the title Saint than James could ever be, as there seemed to be not a single thing that could make his patience even remotely falter, as he very calmly explained, "The appeal to the court's decision has been filed properly and on time. The individual known as Curie has a right to a court appeal like anybody else. As long as the appeal is ongoing, the protection orders are non-enforceable. As long as the protection orders are non-enforceable, Curie remains a person capable of doing business. As long as Curie remains a person capable of doing business, their contract as our customer is active, enforceable, and binding. As our customer, Curie has requested privacy, and for their room to not be accessible to you unless you are specifically invited. As long as the contract is binding, we have no choice but to oblige. No laws are being violated. In fact, bowing to your request would be in violation of the law." James forced himself not to listen to the Terravel's outraged response as he walked by, repeating his "don't engage" mantra to himself. The only thing he picked up on was something about those creatures not having a legal right to challenge them as parents. He bit his lip in order to not focus on it in any way. Things were being handled. Curie was safe. He need not get involved. However, as he was about on one level with the ongoing confrontation, his attention was suddenly pulled towards it as he heard his name being called.
Aldwin,
a familiar voice called out, and his face immediately snapped in the direction of the sound. Levexa was waving over to him, his long ears standing straight up and turning in James's direction, presumably to hear his answer, even if James wasn't about to come any closer or shout back at him.
Congrats to making the list already. If it's not too much trouble, make sure your people know our names, alright? I'm sure there's a billion or two humans who don't know who to vote for yet.
As he spoke, he gestured to himself and Morgoth for a moment. The enormous Ligomordalar nodded his large head in amused agreement. James raised his eyebrows and walked sideways for a moment to look at them as he passed by, slowing his step only slightly to keep within conversation range for a moment longer, while not stopping completely. "You're planning to run?" he asked in mild surprise, but definite approval. Levexar grinned in a way that exposed the long canines behind his lips, while his stiff eyes stared at James, as his head slowly rotated to follow the primate's movement.
"Sure, can't miss our chance to be some of the first Deathworlders on the council, can we?" he replied cockily and crossed his arms. "If you fumble it, at least we'll have a few more runners in the race."
Morgoth laughed loudly, and momentarily shook his body in a way that made the large scales lining his back rattle like a massive chain.
"Indeed. What better way to have people lean on you than to become one of the very pillars holding up the galaxy?"
the Colossus boisterously announced, loud enough that the entire station probably heard him.
"None too far, James."
James laughed, his mood immediately lifted by the giant's absolute enthusiasm. "And with you too," he called back to the man with a laugh. "I'll let the people know who I'm supporting." With no need to worry about votes for himself, he may as well make full use of that fact and get his eggs into as many baskets as he possibly could. Earth had over 10 billion people alone, so if everyone voted in unison, the planet alone could place 2 whole candidates, and that wasn't even counting the rest of the territories. Obviously people wouldn't vote that unanimously, especially not right now, but still, whoever got the favour of humanity could expect a serious boost in their votes. Cora Hoffer and Farian momentarily seemed like they wanted to yell something after James as well, However, a rattling sound coming from Virukshratta's wings, along with a displeased hiss, made them rethink their approach, as the king of the hive made it clear that he did not want another of his guests to be bothered by the troublemakers. Giving one last thumbs up to his fellow Deathworlders, James turned his gaze ahead again, as he hurried on to where he was already being expected. Opening the hatch in the hive's roof with his organic hand pressed to the bioscanner, he quickly descended down into the room. "Did you wake up yet?" he immediately asked without any greeting, causing the heads in the room to turn in his direction. This being one of the few places where breath filters were deemed unnecessary, he was pretty glad to see everyone's faces directly.
Not yet.
Coco was the one to answer, as she mildly shook her head. She ran a hand along her long braid with her eyes closed before she looked up at him again, her green orbs peering into his.
But it can't be much longer, according to the doctors. His condition is improving steadily, and he's no longer in any mortal danger. Praise be to our enhancements.
She smiled, mildly. James nodded. "Anything new from the investigation?" he then asked, to which Andres shook his head this time. "Even reason aren't miracle workers," the Major said, his crimson eyes narrowing slightly at James in very mild amusement. "They just arrived on the scene. At least give them a couple of hours to get their bearings." James sighed but nodded again. "Right," he said, and exhaled briefly. "What about news from Earth?" Admir leaned back from the table he was sitting at to look past the others directly at James, taking over the answering to that one. "Well, things still aren't great, but you probably still have cracked the necessary approval rating for your candidacy, if you had needed it," he informed James, with a casual expression. "Though that means little if we assume that same level of support isn't there from the rest of the galaxy. But that can be changed if we get a good campaign going. All in all, it will depend on how many resources you'll be getting, and if I was a betting man, you'll probably be getting a call about that sooner rather than later. Let's hope for the best." James inhaled very briefly, and let out the breath in a long, slow exhale. "Right," he repeated, as he walked over to his bed. Already waiting there were Nia and Shida, who quickly scooted up to him when he sat down. Both his sister and his girlfriend supportingly laid their heads onto his shoulders, and Nia gently reached out to put her hand onto his chest. "Breathe, James," she said. "Things are hectic enough. You don't need to stress yourself out any more than you are already." Feeling their contact, James managed to relax a bit more. Inhaling more deeply this time, he let out the air even slower than before. "Yeah, you're right," he said, once he had it all out, only inhaling enough to get the sentence out. "It's just, we're so close. I'm sure they made their move now because they feel we're at our weakest, and we kind of are, but with all that we know now, I still feel like we can do this. We're so close, and I just want to do something, you know? Something more than this." He sighed. With long steps, Athena walked up to him, before falling into a cross-legged seating position in front of him, looking up directly with her sky-blue eyes. "We'd all rather be hunting after Paige and his goons, Buzz," she said, and put her hand onto his knee. "But what we're doing here is laying the foundation for that. Even if we get them, that won't matter much if someone else can just immediately take their place. This is about more than just getting the people making trouble right now. This is about tearing open the dark corners they hide in, so that no one else can ever make that same trouble again. And for that, we need someone in position to capitalize on it once they are dragged into the light. Much as I hate to say it, they made you their problem, and you're the one guy that can do it right now. Well, with a lot of help, of course." She smirked at him. James nodded and chuckled slightly. "I'd be pretty screwed on my own. You'll never hear me deny that," he immediately agreed with her teasing. "If only I was half the special, fate-chosen saint that those maniacs expect me to be, things would be much easier." "Yeah, but where would be the fun in that?" Tuya chimed in, walking up to sit down on Nia's other side. "Not much of a success story if someone was always destined for greatness, is it? It would be hard for you to inspire people if you were so super special awesome that nobody could relate anymore. Meanwhile, Sheeda nuzzled up to him, and he leaned his head into the touch and closed his eyes as he enjoyed it. "That's the way they think," she whispered to him. "That you have to be something special to be worth it, and if you aren't, you're lucky if you can get the scraps they offer you. We can't let them win by thinking things would be better if that were true." James hummed in agreement. "You're right," he said. "You're all right. There's no point in thinking how things could be easier anyway. They aren't. But you know what? We'll still get those bastards. And we'll show them why you don't mess with people. Because no matter who it is, they can still mess you up in return." He chuckled to himself at his own rather boisterous declaration. Not long after, Admir's prophecy came true, as James's phone began to ring. "Hello?" He answered it as the room around him became silent. "Hello, James," a familiar voice came back from the speaker. It was the smooth and even voice of Representative Kumar. "If you don't mind, I would like to talk to you privately. Could you possibly return to your secure setup so we may speak face to face?" James swallowed before replying, "Of course, sir." With a hesitant movement, he stood up. As he walked out of his room, he reached his hand out, allowing each one of his friends to reassuringly touch it or bump against it as he passed them. Sheeda gave him a long, encouraging look. The moment of truth was upon him. Not a minute later, he stood in front of the screen. In front of him, he saw the video feed showing Representative Kumar. The man's dark skin shone in the spotlight that was directed at him. His dark hair and his suit were both in pristine condition, without a strand or kernel of dust out of place. "Please, give it to me straight, sir," James requested, as he stood tall at attention, with his arms behind his back and his chest pushed out. "I'm in no mood for long explanations. What has the Council of Governors decided?" Kumar released a low breath and had a serious expression on his face. "We talked long and hard about what would happen after the most recent development," he said, immediately making it obvious that he would not oblige with James's request to get straight out with it. "Many heads of government had different ideas about how we should proceed ever since the false flag attack on the station, and many ideas have been thrown around as to what should be done." Kumar's gaze was serious and firm as he stared right into James's eyes. "However, since the time the election was announced, the tune has changed drastically," he continued. Then he tilted his head ever so slightly. "Are you a gambling man, James?" James slowly shook his head. "Despite evidence to the contrary, I actually am not a big fan of danger," he answered honestly, a mild pit forming in his stomach at the representative's demeanor. Kumar nodded slowly. "Well, but at the very least, I am sure you have heard of the most famous expression in poker, right?" he asked as a follow-up. James nodded again, and he felt like this wasn't going in a good direction. "You have to know when to hold 'em," he began the saying, and Kumar immediately took it upon himself to finish it for James. "And when to fold 'em." He nodded, as if to confirm that James had gotten it right. James swallowed heavily. He knew that quote well. It was used quite often. In fact, he used it himself sometimes. And although the quote did exist in a vacuum technically these days, it was usually followed by a second sentence which stated, "Right now, it's folding time." The saying was meant to convey that you should not overextend yourself. It seemed that Earth may have made its choice. "And right now?" he still asked, simply wanting to get this over with. He held himself together, but inside, his heart was beating like the heaviest drum as he thought about how he would explain their retreat to the others, and what he could do to still make things right even without Earth's direct support. Maybe some of those sponsor offers he had gotten would still be open. "Right now?" Kumar then asked, pulling James back out of his thoughts, as the eyes of the two men met again. and to James's surprise, he suddenly saw a twinkle in Kumar's eyes, the dark orbs lighting up with a sudden flash of light, as he lifted his gaze a bit with the spotlight reflecting in his irises. His so far solemn and serious expression shifted, as the corners of his mouth lifted into a confident, almost aggressive smirk. At that moment, Kumar's face wasn't that of a reserved politician strategizing with his ally. It was that of a proud man, proclaiming loudly that he had gotten exactly what he wanted. With his collected posture breaking apart, Kumar leaned forwards a bit and brought his fist down onto a table that was just out of sight of James's camera, as he loudly exclaimed, "Right now, we hold the fucking line." James was honestly so taken aback that he actually stumbled a step backwards from the sudden change in intensity, while Kumar's grin spread over his entire face, and he stood up straight once again. "Lieutenant Aldwin, the Council of Governance has decided," he announced. "The first stone has been thrown, aiming right for our face, and we're not going to take it lying down. With an overwhelming majority, you have been granted all the necessary resources to give these people the fight they want. If they want war, we'll give them war. There's not a single banner that we won't tear down, not a single skeleton that will be left in the closet, not a single dirty secret that we won't drag to light. Whether they come from our own ranks or not, these people made the mistake to think that they could drag our name through the mud and that we would let them get away with it. Don't worry about the people's approval. Don't worry about the press. Stand your ground and do what's right. Even if some of us may not like it, humanity will have your back."